Hey guys, here's week one, part one, additional devotion as we begin to think about living out our salvation for the life of the world. Week one was about introducing the idea of living as exiles, and if we were doing those messages, I challenged the participants to use the message points and scripture for each day to think devotionally, and I promised I would give a brief thing about each point. Today's point in the notes is in our salvation we are called to live as exiles. And that's true. In our salvation, we're called to live as exiles. If we were going to be honest about the text they use there, Jeremiah 29:4, we would say of Israel in their exile, they were challenged to make the most of their punishment. And it's important that we look honestly at the context of where Israel was and then take up the challenge in our context as the church, because the church is not Israel. Um, and Israel, Old Testament Israel, is not the church, but we have a relationship. So let's do a little background. You guys know I'm a history nerd. As we look at the context of what Jeremiah 29 was all about, Nebuchadnezzar, the year is 597, and Nebuchadnezzar leads an army to Judah, makes quick work of them. He deposes King Jehoiakim, and puts up King Jehoiakim, who doesn't stay in that job for long at all. And then he takes 10,000 Israelites, the artisans, the leading figures, the royalty, and deports them to Babylon. And that's actually the second of three deportations. The first one is much smaller. Man, I'd love to get into the nerdiness of all of that, but I'm trying to do this in 10 to 11 minutes. And then later on, he comes back. Some years later, he comes back, and they siege the city of Jerusalem and just lay waste to it. Before, they had taken 10,000 people, the leading figures, the artisans, items of importance from the temple. All they left behind was the poorest people and the poorest goods. This next time they come back, they lay waste to the city, just total waste to it. And when they come back in 586, if you remember, BC time is counting down to zero, and AD is counting up from zero. And so when they come back, man, they turn the city into a wasteland. Well, Jeremiah 29 is written after that second deportation, and it's important to have that context. The people, every one of these deportations, the people hated it. To say the Babylonians were not nice people is a massive understatement. One of the most telling things to me, some of you guys will remember this because I harped on it quite a while. When we were in Psalm 137 was written by these exiles about that time of exile. And this is what they said: by the waters of Babylon, there we sat down and wept when we remembered Zion. On the willow trees, there we hung up our lyres. For there our captors required of us songs, and our tormentors mirth, saying, sing us one of the songs of Zion. How shall we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? They were really miserable there. And in the prophetic ministry of Jeremiah, they get a word, not through the spoken prophecy, but through the written prophecy. They get this letter. And that's what Jeremiah 29:4 says is, listen, I have this letter. There's this, I'm writing to the exiles whom I have sent into exile in Jerusalem, from Jerusalem to Babylon. They get this letter, and he says, now listen, you're there, and don't miss the context. They are there. Israel is there because they had turned away from God over and over and over again. They rejected God's prophets. They rejected God's morality, God's law, and it was self-inflicted. It was self-inflicted. God quit holding back these evil peoples and nations. As a matter of fact, he uses them. It's a great lesson. God does not endorse man's foolishness, but he doesn't waste man's foolishness. All things will work together for good for those who love the Lord and called according to his purposes. What you meant as evil against me, God meant as good. Over and over again, the Bible has this message. Go back sometime and study the book of Habakkuk, like we walked through it, last year, and just remember, not last year, 2020. Just remember that we don't always understand what God is doing, but God uses everything that we're doing for his glory and for our good. So there's the scene. They're there, and he writes them a prophetic letter through the prophet Jeremiah, and he has a word for them. He's like, you're there, okay, and you won't always be there, okay? You're there because of your sin, right? But now start. I want you to live well there. I have purpose for you, even though you're afflicted and you're oppressed, even though sin has cost you something. Now is the time to, you might say, begin living well. And so he sends them this prophetic letter. All right. Well, there's the background, and as quick as I can make it. Obviously, I could do several 1-hour sessions on how all the history that led up to that moment, the history around that moment, the history of the 100 years around them being there and coming back. Man, wow! But look at time; it's flying by. So the church is not necessarily in the same situation, but God is still the same God. We are more like sojourners. We have not been exiled to the world. We're redeemed in the world, and now the world is not our home. It's not the chief place of our identity. So we are, in similar fashion, where we don't belong, longing for where we do belong. Many of the Israelites in later generations who are still in captivity, they long for an Israel they've never seen. We long for a heaven we've never seen. But we're redeemed here, right? And if the point of our redemption were just heaven, God would not leave us here sojourning. He would not leave us to live as exiles. And I think it's real interesting. If you were to go back and look at Jeremiah 29, verse 4 in various translations, you'll see that there's some language here. Like Israel sinned, and God sent them into exile. Like in the ESV, it says, "I have sent into exile from Jerusalem." See, God says, "I did this." Okay. In the King James Bible, they choose to translate it like this: "I have caused to be carried away from Jerusalem unto Babylon." The New American Standard says, "I've sent into exile." The New International Version says, "I've carried into exile." In other words, this exile is a doing of the Lord. Likewise, our sojourning to live as exiles is a doing of the Lord. It's not just that he saved us from sin and Satan and hell and his wrath, and he's trying to get us to heaven. No, we're going to wind up in our Father's house. But he leaves us as sojourners. He leaves us as exiles so that our salvation will bring him glory on this earth, in this life, and so that our salvation will be a witness and an impact to our culture. And where we started last night was looking at those typical three, this is their language, there are 3 typical postures the church takes toward culture: fortification, domination, and accommodation. And like the Israelites who were sent into exile, the church is left sojourning in exile, left for God's good purposes. And that's what we have to begin to see. We're left in this position of sojourning in exile away from our true home because God has purpose for us. So not the same reasoning, right? But we can receive this prophetic letter for the church too. Here we are, right? Here we are, not where we're going. Here we are, not where we belong. Here we are, not where we're destined to be. We're not here for the same reasons that Israel was sent to Babylon, but we're still contending with the same things that they contended with in Babylon, right? And we may feel like I'm going to hang my guitar in a tree and just sit down here on the side of this river and give up. But it would not. That's how we feel. But what have we been commanded to do? To be salt, to be light, to love our neighbors, to serve whoever needs serving. In other words, we are commanded to live well, to live the gospel, to obey the gospel as sojourners who are living in exile until God calls his church home. Well, that's the thoughts for today's devotional to go with point one in the message outline for this weekend for the life of the world. Thanks, guys.